Welcome back to Chapter 21, Part 4. We're really going to dive much deeper into natural selection in this part and think about some of the subtleties that are involved in natural selection. So let's start out with remembering that natural selection is the only thing that brings about adaptation or adaptive evolution. And it happens because it's acting on the organism's phenotype, even though it's the alleles or the genes that get passed into the next generation. Natural selection acts on the phenotype. So you might have heard some phrases associated with natural selection in the past. You might have heard the struggle for existence, right? Or you might have heard survival of the fittest. And both of those phrases are extremely misleading for many reasons. Number one is that the struggle for existence, that makes it seem like there's direct competition among organisms. And we know that that's not true necessarily. It's not you win or I win kind of situation. It's just like whoever gets the most resources, they're the ones that quote unquote win. But it's not a bad idea. It's just like misunderstood, or it's a little misleading. Survival of the fittest is also a bit misleading because, well, in the first place, the word fittest refers to, in the context that Darwin meant it, he was referring to the concept of fitness. And fitness is not about how strong you are or how intelligent you are. Fitness is defined as the number of offspring that a specific individual or a specific phenotype within a population has. So the offspring that you make. So when you say survival of the fittest, if you're using this like Darwin meant it to be used, then what you're saying is survival of the number of offspring? Oh, no. The survival of the most number of offspring. Yeah, that's literally what he meant. Whoever has the most number of offspring wins. Not your strength, not your intelligence, nothing like that. It's about your offspring. So basically, reproductive success, right? Reproductive success is subtle, and it depends on lots of factors. For example, individuals that are able to collect more food, right? If you're able to collect more food, then you're able to invest more in your own offspring, and therefore you can produce more offspring. So right, it's not necessarily always a direct correlation there. Also, we can think about fitness in terms of relative fitness, like that term survival of the fittest, right? That's talking about the best, yeah? So really, the best is in comparison to everybody else. So we use the term relative fitness to kind of explore that idea of the best. So relative fitness is defined as the contribution of an individual and how much they contribute to the gene pool of the next generation relative to the contributions of other individuals. So here I found this nice little graphic. You've got an individual within the population, and they have something called an absolute fitness of 4. That means that they had 4 babies. And so if we want to calculate relative fitness, we take the population average, which for dolphins we'll call 3. And so the relative fitness is the absolute fitness over the average fitness. And so if your number is greater than 1, then you have higher relative fitness. And if it's less than 1, then you have a lower relative fitness compared to the average. Now that's fitness. What about what happens with natural selection? Like, what are the patterns that happen with natural selection? And we say that there are 3 modes of natural selection. 3 modes. This means patterns, really, of natural selection. There's directional selection, disruptive selection, and stabilizing selection. And I've got some graphs for you on the next slide. But for now, let me give you some definitions, and then we'll get a nice graphical understanding of this. Directional selection occurs when conditions favor individuals at one end of the phenotypic range. So think about all the phenotypes that exist in a population. One version of that does better than all the rest, and if that's on the extreme end of the graph, then that's going to be directional selection. With disruptive selection, this occurs when conditions favor individuals at both extremes, and then stabilizing selection occurs when conditions favor the intermediate. So it's so much easier to understand these definitions when you look at the graphs. So if this is your original population of mice, and if you line them up from lightest to darkest, what this says is that there are not very, very many light mice. And there's not very many dark mice. Most of the mice fit into this kind of average, and that's why this curve is so high. This is the frequency of individuals. So the frequency of the brown mice is highest. The light mice are the light mice have low frequency, and the dark mice have a low frequency. With directional selection, in this example, maybe the lighter colored mice were easier to see against the background. Maybe you have a leafy background in this forest, and that leaf litter is darker. And so the darker mice are going to survive better in that environment. That's directional selection. The ones on one extreme, in this case the dark, are surviving to reproduce better than the ones on the other extreme. With disruptive selection, the ones on both extremes are doing better. Now, you can kind of imagine this as being an environment where you've got some light-colored rocks and some dark-colored rocks. And in this one population, the ones that are surviving better are the light-colored mice and the dark-colored mice. And so the ones that are in the middle, the kind of brownish ones, they're not surviving quite as well. And so we end up having this bimodal distribution. In this case, bimodal means two averages. So the white ones and the dark ones, they each have a very clear average or mode or level of frequency here at being very high. And the darker ones, the brown ones, the intermediate ones, are having a lower survival rate. With stabilizing selection, it's actually the ones in the middle that are doing the very best. So in this case, the ones that are the brown ones are doing much, much better. We have selection against the light ones and the dark ones, and we have survival favoring the ones that are in the middle. This is called stabilizing selection. Here, think about maybe the rocks in the environment are more brownish in color, and so the more brownish mice are the ones that are going to survive better. Natural selection can result in some amazing adaptations. So your book calls them striking, and then shows a picture of a snake head. So I think striking might mean two different things. So some striking adaptations. In this case, let's take a look at our octopus here first. One of the adaptations that octopuses have is for changing their color so that they can blend into their environment. And that is actually pretty amazing that they can blend into their environment so well. We don't know of any other organism that can blend in with its environment so well as an octopus. You might say chameleon, but chameleons don't actually blend into their environment that well. Their color variations are actually part of communication between the sexes. So if you look at a snake, snake's jaws can open wider than their head, basically. So this is their size of their head. They actually disjoint their lower jaw from their upper jaw, and they can put their whole mouth around something that's bigger than their actual head would be. So that's also a pretty amazing adaptation. Natural selection, as I said before, increases the frequency of alleles that enhance survival and reproduction. Adaptive evolution happens when the individuals are increased in the population that have those favorable traits, and other traits are decreased, or they leave the population permanently. Because the environment can change, though. Adaptive evolution is continuous. It's a dynamic process. It never stops. There's not one environment that isn't constantly changing to one degree or another. It could be from season to season or year to year, or it could be something as dramatic as global climate change that we're going through right now. So it turns out that genetic drift and gene flow don't lead to adaptive evolution. They can increase or decrease to match the environment with its environment, the organism with its environment. But that's more due to chance events than to what happens with natural selection, which is making things a better fit to their environment because it enhances survival and reproduction. Also, we just talked about the three main modes of selection, right? Stabilizing, directional, and disruptive. But there is something else called balancing selection. And with balancing selection, it turns out that, maybe everybody does well in the population, depending on what the environment is and what they look like. So there can be more than one, more than two. There could be 3 or more optimal phenotypes in that population. So let's take a look at a couple of examples of balancing selection, and we'll get some more definitions, including heterozygote advantage and frequency-dependent selection. With heterozygote advantage, this occurs when, it's kind of self-explanatory. The heterozygote have a fitness advantage higher than both homozygotes. If this is true, if you're in a situation where the heterozygote is doing better, then natural selection acts to maintain both of the alleles in that population at that locus. And a good example of this is for sickle cell disease. Now, if you have sickle cell disease, this is a deadly disease. There's no cure for sickle cell disease at the moment. And what happens here is that the hemoglobin, which we've already talked about in the past, the hemoglobin molecule changes the shape of the red blood cells. And when that happens, the red blood cells get stuck in the capillaries and doesn't allow the passage of red blood cells. If red blood cells aren't free to travel around your body, then you can have a lack of oxygen at very important organs in your body, like your heart and your brain. If you have the normal allele, then your red blood cells maintain this round shape and can go through the capillaries very easily. So it turns out that if you're heterozygous for sickle cell, then you have some resistance to a disease called malaria. Now, malaria is found in countries around the equator. Like, it's found in India and in the Middle East and throughout much of Africa. The malaria is found. Now, malaria is passed on by mosquitoes, but malaria itself is not a mosquito. It's a parasite that lives in mosquitoes. And when the mosquito bites you, you can get this deadly disease called malaria. If your cells can change shape, then you cannot get the parasite that causes malaria, because that parasite lives inside of the red blood cells that are normal shaped. But they can't live inside these sickle cell shaped cells. So if you have sickle cell anemia, you have a deadly disorder, but you'll never get malaria. If you have only normal red blood cells, you don't have sickle cell disease, but you can get malaria. However, if you're heterozygous, if you can make both kinds of hemoglobin, then turns out that the malaria doesn't live inside of you. It can't live inside of you. And so you're immune to malaria, and you don't have the sickle cell disease because you have both types of hemoglobin. So there's a heterozygote advantage. It's better to be heterozygous for sickle cell if you live in regions where malaria is common. And that's true that in these areas of the globe, more people exist in the heterozygote condition. Unfortunately, that also means that more children are born with sickle cell disease in those areas. The other type of balancing selection is for frequency-dependent selection. And this is such an interesting idea. So frequency-dependent selection is where the fitness, remember that's the reproductive success, right? The fitness of a phenotype depends on how common it is in that population. So this is such a cool example. There are these kind of parasitic fish that have their mouths open on either the right side of their head or the left side of their head. And what these fish do is they come in, they bite the scales and the fish, a little bit of flesh off of the fish that they're preying upon. So they don't eat the whole fish. They just kind of come in and they take some nibbles out of those fish. So again, some of them have their mouths on their left side of their body, and some of them have mouths on the right side of their body. When the right-mouthed fish become more abundant in the population, the prey fish in the population, they start like looking more and more often on their right side, so that they can keep an eye out on for them being nibbled. And what happens is that makes the ones that have the left side mouth better able to survive to reproduce because they're not being noticed as often. So they're better able to survive to reproduce, and then the next generation of these prey fish, like they start looking out on their left side because they're being nibbled more on that side of their body. And so the ones with the right mouth can get away with more food and so forth. So we see this fluctuation between right side mouth and left side mouth frequency over time. And so this is balancing selection, right? It's balancing because of frequency dependence. The frequency dependence, if you're more frequent in the population, you're more likely to be detected as a predator. And if you're less frequent, you're less likely to be detected. And so what that happens is it keeps the phenotypic ratio about 50% over time. The last major concept that we're going to talk about is sexual selection. And sexual selection is a form of natural selection, absolutely. So it didn't get its own category in Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium stuff, but it's a form of natural selection, but only in the mating success part of natural selection. Remember, natural selection was survive and reproduce. So sexual selection really focuses on the reproduce part of natural selection. Sexual selection can result in something called sexual dimorphism. And di means two and morph means appearance. So sexual dimorphism means that you have differences between males and females of a species. And so we could look at this peacock here, and he has these amazing feathers with eye spots, and they're iridescent blue on their bodies. And the females that are much more dull in color, and the reason for this is that females are choosing males that are very bright in color, and they're only mating with the males that have these beautiful feathers. So we also have this word of secondary sexual characteristics. So it's not that the feathers define whether this guy is male or female. It's whether he makes sperm or eggs, right? We've talked about that before. So a secondary sexual characteristic is one that's associated with that sex, but not influencing whether they make sperm or eggs. Secondary sexual characteristic. So the kind of mate choice can result in sexual dimorphism. Now there's two basic kinds of sexual selection. There's intrasexual selection, and that's where you have competition among one sex. Usually it's competition among the males in animal species, but not always. And they're competing for mates. And then there's intersexual selection, and that's where individuals of one sex, and again, this is usually the females, are choosy in selecting their mates. One way to remember this, if you've ever played sports in high school, there was intramural sports and intermural sports. Intramural sports was when you just competed amongst the students within a school, and intermural sports was when you competed against other schools. So intrasexual is one gender, one sex competing, and inter is between two sexes. So what this can result in is showy traits that increase a male's chance of attracting a female, but this also often decreases his chances of survival. And I've got a slide on that in a little bit, but that is one of the kind of outcomes of sexual selection sometimes. There is a hypothesis about why females choose males in this way, and the hypothesis is called the good genes hypothesis. Now, there's actually a lot of evidence for the good genes hypothesis, but so remember, hypothesis is a possible explanation, and there's multiple possible explanations behind sexual selection. So the good gene hypothesis says that females choose males based on their genetic qualities, or maybe their genetic qualities that represent something about their health or something along those lines. Both male traits and the female preference for that trait tend to increase in frequency when the good gene hypothesis is being followed by a particular species. So here we got an example of frogs, and we have frogs that have short calls, and we have frogs that have long calls, so SC for short call and LC for long call. And females tend to prefer males that have the longer call. So the females are choosing males with the longer call, but of course, if a male is going to call longer, then a predator who listens for frog calls to zero in on that prey is more likely to eat the male that is calling longer. So that's very interesting downside of that long call. However, if we look at some of the data, we see that for a couple of different years, in 1995, the long call offspring were better at surviving, although there wasn't any difference in 1996 between the long call and the short call. In the larval growth, and when we say larval, remember we're talking about tadpoles here. The larval growth in 1995 for the long calls and short calls was about the same, but in 96, the larvae survived better. In time to metamorphosis, the ones who called longer had offspring who had shorter metamorphosis times, so changing from tadpole into adult. So the long call seemed to be better in that it allowed the offspring to become sexually mature quicker. All of this stuff about natural selection is very interesting, and you would think that if natural selection were such a powerful force for adaptation, that you'd end up having organisms that were perfectly suited for their environment. And it also turns out that that's just not true. Natural selection cannot end up with perfect organisms for 4 reasons. Number one, selection can only act on existing variations. What this means is that, mutations don't arise on command. You can't just say, hey, it would be great if I had this feature, and then get a mutation, force a mutation and then get that feature. It doesn't work that way. So natural selection is limited to whatever currently exists in the population. Evolution is also limited by historical constraints. And what that means is, again, it's similar to existing variation, but you have to think about back in time. So, for example, bats' wings are made of skin, not feathers, because in the evolutionary history of bats, they have skin and not feathers. So we have historical constraints. Adaptations are often compromises, and we talked about some of those compromises with the frogs and with the birds. Bright colors might attract mates, but they also could attract predators. Same with frogs, right? The frog calls could attract predators as well as mates. So they're often compromises. And the last one is that everything is involved in whether something evolves or not. Right? Chance also plays a role. The environment is changing, and also natural selection is occurring. So we could think about fire and flood and storms. Those can affect the gene pool, but that's not natural selection. And also environments can change. So what might be beneficial in the past, if the environment changes, might not be beneficial anymore. So we don't say that natural selection fashions perfect organisms. We say that natural selection allows better than, right? So it's better than some other option, but it's not perfection. Well, that's all that I have for you today on natural selection and the evolution of populations in general. And I hope that you learned something from this and enjoyed learning about evolution. See you next week.